Welcome to this explainer. You know, when you stand on a beach and look out at the horizon, the ocean just looks like this massive, empty blue void. It feels completely boundless, totally wild. But the reality? That water is actually a highly partitioned, intensely regulated territory governed by a massive geopolitical rulebook. And since 90% of global trade and literally 99% of our international internet data travel through this water, these rules impact your daily life way more than you might realize. So today, we're going completely offshore. We're going to uncover exactly who owns the ocean, how the invisible borders of the sea are drawn, and what actually happens when those rules are broken.
Okay, let's dive right into our nautical chart for this journey. We'll be hitting the constitution of the oceans, drawing the baseline, zoning the sea, the high seas, rocks, islands, and disputes, and finally enforcing the rules. We're taking a spatial journey together, starting right at the coastline and traveling straight out into the depths of international waters.
Section 1. Constitution of the Oceans, the ultimate rulebook governing 70% of the planet.
To really understand the maritime world, we have to start with the foundational framework holding this entire global system together. I'm talking about the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, universally known as UNCLOS. Now, treaty law can sometimes feel a bit toothless, right? But UNCLOS is widely revered as the literal constitution for the oceans. It officially binds 168 parties, plus the European Union. But here's the truly fascinating part. It's so globally powerful that even non-parties, most notably the United States, treat its core rules regarding maritime zones and navigation as binding customary international law. Whether a nation actually signed the 1982 document or not, the rules codified within it are the accepted reality of how the globe navigates 70% of the planet's surface.
Section 2. Drawing the baseline where the ocean begins. Before a country can claim any ocean, we have to figure out exactly where their territory actually starts. Everything in maritime law begins with the baseline. Under Article 5 of UN Clause, this normal baseline is the low water line along the coast. Think of this baseline as the ultimate, non-negotiable anchor for a state's sovereign power. From this exact point on the shore, a country's control is going to steadily diminish the further out to sea we travel. Sure, there are exceptions, like drawing straight baselines across deeply indented coasts or river mouths, but this line is basically the starting pistol for every single maritime claim we're about to explore.
Section 3. Zoning the sea, the tug of war, coastal sovereignty versus international freedom.
Now we're transitioning into a literal, legal tug-of-war between a coastal nation's desire for power and the rest of the world's desire for navigational freedom. The crucial point here is exactly 12 nautical miles from the baseline. Under Article 3, this is the absolute limit of the territorial sea. Within this 12-mile band, a coastal state enjoys full, absolute sovereignty. They own the water, the seabed below it, and the airspace above it. The whole shebang. But because global trade absolutely relies on moving ships around the planet, there is one major history-altering exception to this absolute power.
That exception is innocent passage, found in Articles 17 through 26. Basically, a coastal state must allow foreign ships to pass through their 12-mile sovereign waters, provided the passage is continuous, expeditious, and peaceful. But make no mistake, the rules of innocent passage are remarkably strict. You can't fish, you can't willfully pollute, you can't launch aircraft or gather intelligence. And if you're a foreign submarine passing through these sovereign waters, you can't sneak around. You are legally required to navigate on the surface and proudly show your flag. If a warship breaks these rules, the coastal state can demand they leave immediately.
Continuing our journey out to 24 nautical miles from the baseline, we hit the contiguous zone. Here, a major shift happens. The coastal state legally loses outright sovereignty. They don't own this water. However, Article 33 grants them vital enforcement control. It acts as a buffer zone where a state can prevent and punish infringements of its customs, fiscal, immigration, and sanitary laws. It's essentially an enforcement patrol zone to catch smugglers or rule breakers before they slip into the fully sovereign 12-mile limit, or, conversely, to catch them as they flee.
Pushing much further out, we reach 200 nautical miles from the baseline. This is the famous Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ. Now the tug-of-war really shifts. In the EEZ, the coastal state only has sovereign rights over natural resources. They don't own the water itself, but they absolutely own the wealth inside it. That means exploring and exploiting fish in the water and oil or gas in the seabed. They also control marine scientific research here. But they have to share the space. All other nations completely regain their high seas freedoms of navigation, overflight, and the ability to lay submarine cables. Interestingly, if a coastal state can't catch all the fish it's safely allowed to in its EEZ, it's technically supposed to give other states access to the surplus. Though honestly, that's rarely enforced in practice.
And this progression brilliantly illustrates what we call the diminishing sovereignty motif.
Just think about it. As we travel from the 12-mile mark to the 24-mile mark, out to the 200-mile mark, a coastal state's absolute ironclad control slowly dilutes. It goes from full sovereignty down to mere enforcement control, and finally dilutes into purely economic resource rights.
Section 4. The High Seas, the Common Heritage of Mankind. Pushing past the EEZ, we finally arrive at the high seas, and beneath it, the deep seabed, legally known as the area. Out here, Article 89 is incredibly clear. No single state can validly subject any part of the high seas to its sovereignty. The deep seabed is actually declared the common heritage of mankind, administered by the International Seabed Authority. On the high seas, ships are governed almost entirely by the state whose flag they fly. It's called flag state jurisdiction. However, international law recognizes that we can't just have total lawlessness. There are exceptions where any state can intervene. The most notable? Piracy. Under UN clause, piracy attracts universal jurisdiction. If a pirate ship commits acts on the high seas, well outside of any country's territorial waters, any state's warships can seize them and prosecute them. Universal crimes against humanity, like the slave trade, also allow for intervention out in the deep blue.
Section 5. Rocks, islands, and disputes. When geography gets messy.
Up until now, we've kind of assumed coastlines are straightforward. But what happens when geography gets messy? Well, it usually comes down to one single provision, Article 121. There's a subtle but incredibly vital legal distinction here that leads directly to the massive geopolitical disputes we see dominating the news today. If a feature is naturally formed, above water at high tide, and can sustain human habitation or an economic life of its own, it's legally an island, and that generates a massive 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. But if that exact same piece of rock cannot sustain human life or an economic life, it's legally just a rock, and a rock only generates a 12-mile territorial sea. It gets 0 EEZ. Neutrally applying this exact test is how the highly publicized 2016 South China Sea arbitration evaluated features in the Spratly Islands, determining that none of the features in question were capable of generating an EEZ based on this strict objective capacity standard.
Now, these complex distinctions didn't just appear out of thin air. They evolved through decades of high-stakes international court cases. In 1951, the Anglo-Norwegian fisheries case established the doctrine for drawing straight baselines on jagged coasts, a rule that was later codified right into UN close. In 1969, the North Sea continental shelf case proved that when dividing shelves between neighbors, courts look for an equitable result, not just drawing a line perfectly down the middle. Then the massive UN close framework adopted in 1982 brought it all together, setting the stage for modern tribunals, like that 2016 arbitration, to interpret these incredibly high-stakes definitions.
Section 6. Enforcing the rules, the reality of international law.
So, having a beautifully crafted rulebook and a history of case law is great, but how does a coastal state actually enforce these laws against a fleeing rule breaker on the open water? The answer lies in the highly dramatic rules of hot pursuit under Article 111. But it's not a movie free-for-all. It's a highly specific legal process. Step 1. The chase must begin while the offending foreign vessel is still inside the coastal state's jurisdiction, like the territorial sea or the EEZ for a fishing violation. Step 2, the pursuit has to be continuous and uninterrupted. You can't lose them, go home, and try to catch them tomorrow. And step 3, here's the geopolitical catch, the right of hot pursuit ceases immediately the very second that fleeing ship crosses into the territorial sea of its own country or any third state. The chase is legally over.
If the chase fails, or there's just a fundamental disagreement about zones, states are supposed to settle disputes peacefully. UN close established mandatory tribunals, like the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, known as ITLOS, alongside the International Court of Justice. But here is the reality check. Enforcement ultimately relies entirely on state cooperation. Under Article 298, countries can legally declare optional exceptions. They can literally opt out of compulsory binding settlements for highly sensitive issues like sea boundary delimitations and military activities. For instance, in that 2016 South China Sea arbitration we mentioned earlier, China had previously made a declaration under Article 298. This led them to completely reject the tribunal's jurisdiction and the final award, perfectly illustrating the practical limits of this system when a state just refuses to cooperate.
Which brings us to our final, provocative thought. We spent this explainer mapping out a brilliant, intricate system that dictates exactly who owns what, zone by zone. But if this grand constitution for the oceans ultimately relies so heavily on voluntary state cooperation and features massive opt-out clauses for military and boundary disputes, who really rules the deep? It's a question that maritime lawyers, Navy admirals, and geopolitical strategists wrestle with every single day. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Stay curious, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.